Welcome to the Planetary Republic of Comics, Module 2, Comics as Social Commentary. I am Professor Frederick Luis Aldama here at The Ohio State University. It is a certainty that creators of comics from all over the world choose to use visual, verbal shaping devices to distill and reconstruct the social tissue that makes up our global reality. Because comics are built in and through all our society, they can play a role in shaping social values. It is the reconstruction of the building blocks of reality in comics that led to the upswelling of fears of its turning youth into criminals or sexual deviants, or its subversive revolutionary potential. It's why countries have used comics as an appendage of imperialist global maneuverings. It's why some governments put into play cultural policies that actively use the comic book format to maintain the status quo. For instance, after World War II, the US government translated Blondie into Japanese to massively promote in Japan a US democracy that promised the American way of life: white picket suburban fences, car, and 2.5 kids. As Paul Gravett sums up in his book Comics Art, throughout their history, comics have been co-opted to serve a country's dominant ideology, most obviously as wartime propaganda, official educational messages, or as weapons in cultural imperialism. But they can also question and threaten authority, end quote. Indeed, as a relatively inexpensive fictional and non-fictional narrative format that packs a swift visual and verbal punch, many author-artists living within climates of repression and oppression have used comics as a means to open eyes to social injustices. The visual-verbal one-two punch of comics engages readers in ways that can convey both progressive and reactionary worldviews in an especially effective way. Hence, we see in the Planetary Republic of Comics how creators have used the comic books to uncritically reproduce the status quo. In France, Hergé's racist portrayal of Asians and Africans is a case in point. In the US, Will Eisner created a racist representation of African Americans with his character Ebony in The Spirit. In Brazil, Mauricio de Sousa, his comics have reproduced the white versus black racial caste system and nostalgia for a conservative national past. In Mexico, there's Yolanda Vargas Dulce's creation of a racist minstrel Pickaninny type with her black protagonist Memín Penguin. Scholars have variously discussed both how comics create racist stereotypes and have the potential to overturn racist stereotypes and to complicate racial identity in comics. For instance, Adelifu Nama considers how black characters have been created either to reinforce racist stereotypes or to challenge conventional and preconceived notions concerning black racial identity by offering a futuristic and fantastic vision of blackness that transcended and potentially shattered calcified notions of blackness as a racial category and source of cultural meaning. Scholars have also considered how comics can serve as a means to critique and question racism, sexism, classism, ableism, and genocide and extreme forms of oppression that include state-sanctioned torture, imprisonment, and murder. For instance, Monica Cho recognizes the unique potential of comics to use visual shaping devices to visualize race in Asian comics in ways that depict the look of race in expected and usual ways to new interpretive results, end quote. Or that overturn the assumptions about Asian and Asian American experience identity. In either case, she considers how Asian and Asian American creators use the visual tools of comics to redeploy the public fantasies about them that have been shaped by material history and popular culture, politics, social science, and economics, end quote. Jose Alanis likewise considers how comics are particularly good at showing readers things that can't be said about disability. In my recent book, Latinx Superheroes in Mainstream Comics, I discuss how DC and Marvel comics often reproduced Latinos as bandidos, buffoons, or hypersexualized and exotic objects. Other scholars have considered how creators who choose the visual verbal format of nonfiction comics to simultaneously critically examine the horrors of war, ethnic genocide, and terrorism, as well as call attention to its own formal construction of the events told. For scholar Hilary Shute, creators such as Art Spiegelman with his Mouse, Joe Sacco with Palestine, and Marjorie Satrapi with Persepolis make, quote, textualization conspicuous by inscribing the context in its graphic, end quote. Jan Beitens and Hugo Frey consider how Middle Eastern and African comics creators use visuals to give shape to localized eyewitness narratives and family stories to involve the reader deeply in their plots and plights. By choosing the visual verbal narrative format, these authors clear, quote, a space of sensitivity and also directness that can appear cliched in the novel and especially film, end quote. Comic book creators around the world are breathing subjects, creating in time and place as shaped by political, social, and historical circumstances. While they exist as social creatures grown within the social that can and does constrain how they seek to create their comics, some go out of their way to use comics as a way to open readers' eyes to a global social tissue that's ripping apart. In the 1960s and 70s, those creators of the underground comic scenes in the US and Europe created story worlds built in and around the affirmation of the body and anti-establishment ways of existing. For instance, in 1971, Guy Caldwell published Inner City Romance, issue 1, that includes all sorts of racial characters and straight and queer sexual configurations. And he does so in ways that ultimately offer a poignant social and political critique of an anti-authoritarian comics movement that failed to see how drugs themselves were destroying the urban poor. He did so to call out the racism and sexism in society and also implicitly reproduced in the underground comics scene. He did so to critique a U.S. increasingly built on the back of its prison and military-industrial complex. In Italy during this period, there appeared an anti-heroic, erotic-affirming comics known as the fumetti neri, or black comics, as well as the fumetti d'autore. In these formats, we see creators using graphic depictions of the body and sex as a way to critique Italy's conservative social mores and socio-political scene. And in Spain, there appeared the work of Carlos Jimenez. For instance, he used the autobiographical mode in Parazuelos to critique Franco's dictatorship. With creators making comics in South American countries with extreme repressive policies, we see many creators, artists, having chosen various modes to critique and or reproduce the status quo. For instance, the military dictatorship in Uruguay mostly suppressed the making of comics altogether. When El Dedo came into print in 1982, the junta killed off the comic after only 6 issues. And while Wambia had a longer run of 16 years, it was heavily censored. In the late 1960s and 70s, Argentinian creators such as Héctor Herman Osterheld and Alberto Brescia chose to use the comic book format to tackle the socio-political issues directly within a repressive military nation-state. They created, for instance, in 1968, the non-fiction comic Che, which was swiftly removed from circulation by the government. And to protect themselves as much as possible, Brescia buried one copy of the comic in his backyard and destroyed the originals. Osterheld disappeared and was later found murdered. And after receiving death threats, Brescia began creating apolitical comics and comic book adaptations of famous novels. This is to say, while repressive measures have been put into play the world over, they vary in degree. Osterheld's disappearance and murder at the hands of the military junta attests to the way in which his graphic narratives and his membership in the leftist Monde Cartoneros group struck very serious chords in Argentina in the 1970s. It is also why his work and that of Brescia became central in inspiring a new generation of creators in a 1980s post-dictatorship Argentina. Others choose to disguise their critique of the establishment. For instance, we see in the work of Mexicans Gabriel Vargas Bernal and Rius with his Los Supermachos, we see the appearance of lightweight and juvenile comics, but that on the surface, once we scratch them, we see a critical examination of Mexico's socio-political and global capitalist scene. Argentinian creator Quino and his wildly popular Mafalda portrays a light-skinned middle-class family, but in ways that promote communal opposition to individualism and that level a critique at caste and class structure in Latin America. Mafalda portrayed the anti-authoritarian position of the middle class after the military brutally attacked and murdered students at the University of Buenos Aires. Quino used humor as the double code in Mafalda that leveled a critique of everyday events and politics. This use of double coding to critique existing socio-political contexts has also been used by creators in Africa. Zimbabwean comic strip Chikawama that ran in the newspaper The Daily News in the early 2000s, we see a story that at once upholds the values of the status quo. The newspaper was privately owned, but that in following the life of an ordinary character like Chikawama or Chiki, who struggles with all the economic and political changes around him. Written in a climate of total repression of artists and journalists, acts of intimidation were common in Zimbabwe in the 2000s. Chiki's interactions with other characters in everyday settings overlay a world rife with tragedies that result from political corruption. Expatriate Iranian creator Marjan Satrapi uses this double-coded social critique in the making of Persepolis. The visual style she chooses is very simple and seemingly aimed at a young readership. However, once the story world unfolds, we see that this is simply a means to convey, through a child's perspective, the violent upheaval of life in Iran, especially for children and women, under the Shah and during the Islamic Revolution. And within this double coding, we are given an additional layer, the rich and complex ancient history of the Middle East. Comic book creators the world over have used the form as a formal means to critique the horrors of genocide and war, especially experienced by the common people. In Japan, for instance, Holocaust survivor Keiji Nakazawa created the 1963 published Hadashi no Jin. In 2004, it was been translated into English as Barefoot Jin. Nakazawa used a gritty visual style to tell the story of a young boy and his family as post-Hiroshima survivors. Along the way, readers experience a full exploration and critique of US and Japanese imperialism and the politics involved that led to the unnecessary, brutal suffering of the people. Others have chosen to critique the socio-political mechanisms that have played a role in acts of genocide. There's the work of Joe Saka, who created Palestine to promote social awareness concerning the Israeli occupation of Palestinian lands. He spent 2 months in Jerusalem and the occupied territories conducting research. While the comic seems to be rather light in the way that he writes himself into the story, it actually presents a harsh critique of how two government entities create such suffering for the many. And Belgian artist J.P. Stassen obliquely depicts the horrors of the genocide in Deo Gratias, A Tale of Rwanda. Like other comic book creators, Stassen chooses to convey the horrors of the Tutsi genocide in Rwanda through the eyes of a young person, Deo Gratias. He is Hutu, but his love interest, Benigne, is a Tutsi. He plays a part in her death. With his demise and descent into madness, he thinks he's become a dog and visually appears to be a hybrid boy-dog. Readers also experience a country descending into violence. Several recent comics from around the globe have focused on the topic of incarceration and the social, racial, political injustices of this repressive tool of the nation state. For instance, in 2007, there appeared the powerful comic vignette by death row inmate Mumia Abu-Jamal that appeared in Peter Cooper's edited World War III Illustrated Issue 3, Facts on the Ground. And in Japan, Kazuichi Hanawa published Doing Time in 2010. Here he distilled and reconstructed in comic book form. Hanawa takes his own experience of life in prison to powerfully convey how prison life aims to kill the soul through sensory monotony and deprivation. As discussed in this module, comics have been used to support the status quo. They have been used as propaganda. They have also been used to open readers' eyes to the all variety of social, racial, sexual, bodily injustices in the world.